Our top stories tonight leave us in South Central LA at Chico State University. It's not an HBCU, it's actually a Hispanic serving institution, and the number of Black students enrolled has been dropping. Now, what's interesting is the school recently celebrated the return of the historically Black sorority, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. The university's Pi Xi chapter was first chartered in 1986, and it's been essentially non-existent since 2008. Because of the lack of Black students. But the chapter recently welcomed their new members this spring, and the traveling exhibit is now telling their story of resilience. Congrats to those ladies. Now, Delta Sigma Theta is just one of the Divine Nine historically Black Greek letter organizations. They were born out of necessity when Black students were denied joining other organizations because of the color of their skin. It created community for Black students on these predominantly white campuses and a space to share in Black joy and creativity. It also lended itself as a way to mobilize for change. Sororities and fraternities gave us a place to be ourselves. Now, as we learn more about identity, specifically in this case, sexual identity, is it time for Black Greek life to evolve? Joining me now to answer that question is Dr. Michelle Allen. She is a graduate of Savannah State University and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. Also joining us is Brenton Brock, Stillman College alumnus and member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Welcome to theGrio to my two dear friends here. Dr. Allen, I'm going to start with you on the basic level of making sure our organizations are safe spaces for people of all sexual identities. Do we have a problem?
I think we do. When we think about, the performance that people that are Black are sort of asked to, engage in when they're in the workplace, or the performance that we ask students that are Black that are attending predominantly white institutions, why would we then ask Black people that are joining and pledging our lives to these Black Greek letter fraternities and sororities to perform masculinity or perform femininity? I think as long as there's a commitment to service and scholarship and sisterhood, in my case, then we're looking for women that hold those values. And so, the marginalization that we have for people that are a part of the LGBTQ community and all of these organizations is something that we absolutely need to address.
Talk to me about how they're marginalized, though, because there are people who will say, well, there are gay people, there are lesbian people in all the organizations. That's clear. There's no problem. I mean, I hear that all the time. It's not my position, but I hear that all the time. What do you say to those people?
Yeah, I think we have to draw the distinction between tolerance and inclusion. Right. So, yes, there are members of the LGBT community that are represented in these organizations, but are we doing what we need to do in order to foster an inclusive environment? If you're having a chapter meeting, can a masculine presenting woman come into that chapter meeting wearing a button down, a bow tie, a tie and slacks? Or is there the required performance of femininity in wearing stockings and a skirt, suit, or a dress? And so I think there is that delineation that we need to make between tolerance and inclusion. And it may not always be something that people are saying out loud, right? It reminds me kind of the conversations you may have with an older aunt who refuses to acknowledge your wife, like in my case, my wife, as my wife, instead calls her like my friend or my roommate.
Friend, right?
Right? So it's not overt discrimination, but it's about the environment that we're having. Is it really a safe and inclusive space? And I think there's some work to do there.
Well, that's overt enough, and that level of microaggression is troublesome. Brenton, tell me if I'm wrong. All right, I'm going to make a semi-hot take here. That it is much easier to be, let me not use the word easier. It is far more common to find out lesbian women in sororities than it is to find out gay men in fraternities, particularly at the undergrad level, that there's a way that you can navigate that, at least on some campuses, without as much of a challenge. There's homophobia in both cases, but that because of the kind of compulsory masculinity that one must perform to even express interest in a Black Greek letter fraternity, it's even harder to be queer identifying or not performing traditional masculinities and make line.
No, I think there's a great observation, and I think that we must first start by delineating between homophobia and effing-phobia. This idea that there's this phobia.
What's that second word you said? I don't know that word.
Effing-phobia. Effing-phobia is a phenomenon where we are phobic around femininity in male bodies.
Oh, okay. I thought you was cussing at me for a minute. Okay, go ahead.
No. So we cannot conflate the two around homophobia and effing-phobia, because we oftentimes realize as male organizations, there seems to be, I'm going to respond to the hot take, it's not a bothersome to us for you to be gay and masculine and presenting. But when you start queering your gender performance, that's when it's like, oh, we are built on masculinity and manhood. And so my response to the earlier question, we can't conflate gender and sexuality, because the sexual politics and how one performs gender by being a masculine female versus being a feminine female, you have a lot of closeted feminine female and you have a lot of closeted masculine men. But the disruption comes when we try to disrupt gender politics. And organizations such as my own organization, we're built on manhood. And manhood is a specific presentation in and outside of the Black community. So I think if we have a conversation about problems, we have to take a serious consideration of how we identify Black manhood or Black womanhood, even if...
How do we, though? Tell me how we do. I mean, so you said you're a member of Omega Psi Phi. I will say that particular organization in many ways is maybe the most sort of profound embodiment or representation of hypermasculinity, at least in terms of how we stereotype fraternities. Like they'll say the alphas are the bookish ones. They'll say the Qs and the sigmas are often the athletes. They're often the, even the idea of barking, right? I mean, being a cute dog, there's a kind of narrative around masculinity in those organizations that may offer not just a particular gender performance, but a particular hypermasculine performance.
Yes, it is a hypermasculine performance. It is one that is also courageous too, to identify, it's nuanced because there's a respectability component, but then this idea to radically bark like a dog on campus, outside of campus, in the middle of a grocery store. That performance of barking can be both masculine and both anti-respectable in a particular way, because you're supposed to hold your book, be nerdish, be respectable, don't cause any kind of disturbance. And when you cause a disturbance, you're vulnerable to being, you're vulnerable to the structures of anti-Blackness. You're too loud in the public, then you'll be punished for being too loud in the public. But to be a member of Omega Psi Phi, I understand the stereotypes of hypermasculinity, and oftentimes we perpetuate that narrative in who we allow access into the organization and who we don't allow access to the organization. That's just the truth about it. So for me, as we are kind of perpetuating these narratives, these organizations have to realign themselves with our values. How do we identify with how manhood shows up? And manhood shows up as defined by us is not about who you have sex with, just to be quite frank, or your gender performance. You have a lot of brothers who identify as male, but still have a queering masculinity, but also that doesn't get to the front line. So I understand it doesn't get to the website, perhaps.
No, it definitely doesn't make it to the website. And that creates a really complex dynamic for both men and women, or however people perform or identify. I want y'all to hang out for a minute, take a break with me. We're going to come back on the other side and have a deeper conversation about this, because this is so important. Everybody stay with us here. Welcome back to theGrio with Marc Lamont Hill. We've been talking to Dr. Michelle Allen. She's a graduate of Savannah State University and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We were also talking to Brenton Brock. He's a Stillman College alum and a member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. Dr. Allen, help me think through how we move this ball forward. I mean, there's a way that in popular culture, we see more representations of queer identified people. We see people assume public office in ways that they didn't before, or whether somebody like a Pete Buttigieg, for example, right? I mean, you have people who literally are able to become cabinet members who identify as queer, when 30 years ago that wasn't possible. I see churches helmed by queer women and queer men. It seems like the ball is moving forward in certain ways. Is Greek life a step behind, or are they moving forward slowly in the same way?
I would say, maybe I'm being optimistic, but I would like to say moving forward slowly, right? I think in order to keep the ball moving and to be a little bit more progressive in it, I think we just need radical education. And I don't mean radical in a way that sounds, hyperbolic. I mean, the idea is that we need to be able to have people informed about the difference that Brenton brought forth before, the idea between gender performance and sexual orientation and sexuality, right? And providing education around that and really debunking and decolonizing our understanding around what it means to be a queer presenting person and what that means to be and how that relates rather to being Black African American, right? I think sometimes there's this connotation or this idea that the two are separate, where we ask people to engage in identity politics and choose their Blackness over other identities that may be equally important to them. And so I think we have to do more to really draw home the importance of intersectionality and provide education for for the chapter advisors, the undergraduate advisors, and the alumni chapters that often support the undergraduate students. We're asking 19, 20, 21-year-olds to make decisions about lifetime commitments. And I think in some ways, our undergraduate students are more progressive in their understanding. And so we have to have that coupled with the education that we provide the alumni members.
That's a tough one. You know, I think you hit the nail on the head, right? So much of the decision-making process is being done by people who are 19 and 20 years old.
Yeah.
And there's a way, as you said, that could be great, right? Because there's a 19-year-old who might be much more likely to be willing to have a queer line brother, a queer neo, that might be more likely than that 50-year-old alumni, 60-year-old alumni member, right? That might be the case. There's also the way that people are committed to certain narratives themselves about their chapter, about their own identities and such. And so I could see, Brenton, a way where the chapter of Q's at a certain place, or the chapter of Iotas in a place says, you know what, we don't really care that the person's gay, but I don't want to be a gay chapter. I don't want the gay person on my line. I don't want the gay person in my chapter, because we don't want to be identified by that. We don't want to be connected to that because of the kind of homophobia that people carry with them, even when they don't realize it. I've seen this having worked with Black Greek letter organizations around the country, all of them, is they'll be like, yeah, we don't care if they're gay. We just don't want them to act gay. We don't want them to look gay, kind of to your point about performance. How do you navigate that with 19 and 20-year-olds?
I think we just have to tell the truth. And the truth about it is, because we don't want to conflate being gay and being queer as the same. And so as we say, we want queer line brothers and queer, line sisters, but queerness is a particular polity. And a lot of even gay members or gay people don't identify with a queer politic, which is how you'll have a gay closeted brother who can say and defend the chapter, say, I don't want this chapter to be a gay chapter. I don't want it to be narrated that way. Well, that's a gay Black man still participating in respectability. That's not queer at all. But the question becomes, how do we measure progress? Do we measure progress on including queer identifying people and queer in your gender, queer in your politics? Or do we align ourselves in solidarity with queer communities and still evaluate our service agendas? How do we service queer identifying people? Does progression mean integration? Or does progression look like a possibility of standing in solidarity with those who are genderqueer in a Black world? If we have an intramural conversation, do Black people have access to gender in the first place? Or sexuality in the first place? And if not, how then do we stand up and show up for people who are Black as they are queer?
Michelle, I'm going to ask you a question, and then Brenton, I want you to respond as well before we go. What do you say to the person who says these organizations are so deeply rooted in homophobia, like other spaces, churches, music, whatever, that maybe we can't redeem them? Maybe queer folks shouldn't be fighting for inclusion in spaces that don't want them there. That maybe the idea is to build something different because these organizations just don't have the capacity to genuinely understand, the real possibilities of a progressive gender politics.
I challenge that, right? I hear that these organizations are rooted in homophobia, but I also, in my understanding and in my experience, I think these organizations are rooted in fighting for the marginalized and upliftment, right? And so when I hear that, I think there is a hypocrisy that's happening that needs to be addressed, right? I think if these organizations are going to continue to serve the community and Black African diaspora, then I think we have to expand and make sure that we're including people that are a part of the LGBTQIA community, right? And so to the point, it has to be something that is explicit in our policies, in our membership procedures, in our service, in our scholarship, right? And so I think if these organizations are being true to who they are, then advocating for, including, enlisting policy, engaging in policy reform that includes people that are marginalized on the basis of gender or sexual orientation is important. And so I hear that these organizations are rooted in social activism and giving voice to those who have been silenced. And so I think there has to be a way that we address the hypocrisy so that we can be true to who we are. And to me, that includes advocating for, making room for, and creating policy for people that are marginalized on the basis of gender identity and sexual orientation.
Wow, powerful words. We're out of time, unfortunately. or maybe fortunately, I get to cut the queue off, and that gives me a little bit of pleasure. We're going to keep this conversation going. We're going to continue to talk about what it means for Black Greek letter organizations to move into a progressive space, or a more progressive, even radical space, not just on issues of sexuality, but issues of class, issues of gender, issues of race, even. Welcome back to theGrio with Marc Lamont Hill. We've been talking to Dr. Michelle Allen. She's a graduate of Savannah State University and a member of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority Incorporated. We were also talking to Brenton Brock. He's a Stillman College alum and a member of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. All right, I'll give you a last word, my brother.
So I will respond to the young person asking the question to say that these organizations are not redeemable. I think they were defined and founded upon Black respectable principles at Black institutions that are neoliberal with an agenda that is always attached to respectability. So for me, I say and stand in solidarity with young undergraduate students who ask the question, who are queer and gender non-conforming, non-binary, and they ask the question about joining organizations. And for me, integration is not always progress. And so currently I serve as an advisor to the TAG student group, which is the LGBTQ and Alliance group at the University of the District of Columbia, where we service undergraduate students who want that fraternal and sister sorority bond, because we are Black people, but to create a space that is uniquely designed.
If you could do it again, would you still be a Q?
Yes.
Okay. Just wondering. I had to ask that, given what you just said. I thought you was finna say no.
That's what I was thinking too.
Well, it's interesting because I'm a Black masculine man. I stand in solidarity with queer identifying people. I wouldn't integrate them to my fraternity and make them most vulnerable to a violence that I know operates in these Black spaces. Just because it's a safe, segregated space, that doesn't mean it's a non-violent space. So I
guess the question would be, why would you want to be part of something that creates a violent space for people?
Where can we go that is non-violent?
It's a fair point. I mean, I would say the same thing even about pledge. I mean, I think there's a contradiction there, but I think we're all holding it.
Yeah, I mean,
right.
it is a contradiction, but there's also, I mean, I just find sacred when I'm in a chapter meeting with Black brothers and a brother is crying and weeping and we are doing a particular type of care. I appreciate that. Friendship is essential to the soul. Like, I do value that. I appreciate that. I also know there are other people. Trans women need spaces.
Yeah, and it ain't the pan hell. You're right. I mean,
right. Right now, right?
Right,
I don't know.
now.
I'm always optimistic and hopeful that we can get advocacy to make these organizations safer. But I hear what you're saying, Brenton. I hear what you're saying.
We're gonna have to end it there. Brenton, thank you so much for joining me. Dr. Allen, thank you so much for joining me. Two brilliant people with brilliant analysis.